The gun barrel was 3 feet from a 6-year-old's face, and nobody on that sidewalk knew the man kneeling by the flower cart could close that distance before the shooter's finger finished twitching. Jack Coleman had been reaching for a bruised peach when the world tilted. He heard it before he saw it, a scuff of shoes too fast for a Tuesday afternoon, a van door sliding open a half-second too smooth, the particular silence of men who had rehearsed something ugly. His hand was still around the peach when his body made a decision his mind hadn't caught up to yet. 11 years of training does not leave a person just because he wants it to. It waits. It sleeps. And on that sidewalk, outside a flower cart on a street he walked past twice a week to save $4 on groceries, it woke up. 2 men. One holding a little girl's arm in a grip that was already leaving marks. One covering the street with a pistol low against his leg, pretending to be a bystander. A third behind the wheel of the van, engine running, mirrors angled wrong for a man who wasn't watching for a tail. Jack cataloged all of it in under 2 seconds, the way he used to catalog rooms before breaching them, and by the time the girl let out the first half of a scream, he was already moving. He didn't run. Running announces you. He walked, fast and unremarkable, the way a father walks toward a child who's fallen and skinned a knee, and he was inside the first man's reach before the man understood that the day had changed shape. Jack took the wrist holding the girl and broke the grip without breaking the man's arm, because that was still a public sidewalk in daylight and there were things you didn't need to do that you could still choose not to do. The girl stumbled free. The second man swung the pistol up, and Jack was already inside that arc too, redirecting it toward the sky as it fired once, the sound cracking off the storefronts, and then the man was on the ground with the wind gone out of him and the gun somewhere under a parked car. The van lurched forward, tires screaming, and Jack let it go. He wasn't here to be a hero. He was here to make sure a little girl in a yellow raincoat got to keep breathing, and she was breathing, sobbing and breathing, backed against the flower cart with her hands pressed to her mouth. "Hey," Jack said, and his voice was nothing like the version of him that had just taken 2 grown men apart in under 10 seconds. It was soft. It was the voice he used at bedtime. "Hey, you're okay. You're okay now. Where's your mama?" The girl couldn't speak yet, just nodded and pointed vaguely down the block, toward a black car and 2 men in suits sprinting toward them, too late, the way security always arrives a half-second after it matters. Jack didn't wait for them. He crouched, made sure her knees weren't skinned, made sure her breathing was evening out, and then, as sirens started somewhere in the distance, he did the only thing that made sense to a man who had spent a decade being a ghost. He stood, touched the girl's shoulder once, and walked away into the crowd that was already gathering, already pointing, already reaching for phones. By the time the girl's mother arrived, breathless and clawing her way through onlookers, the man who had saved her daughter's life was gone, and all that was left of him was a strip of frayed paracord that had slipped from his jacket pocket during the struggle, lying forgotten near the flower cart. Chloe Bishop would spend the next 3 days trying to describe him to her mother. Tall. Kind eyes. Smelled like the inside of a hardware store. And when the words ran out, when 6-year-old vocabulary couldn't carry the size of what she'd felt, she settled on the only phrase that fit. "He was my guardian angel, Mommy." Evelyn Bishop did not believe in guardian angels. She believed in security contracts, in redundant systems, in the 12 cameras that had captured everything except a clear shot of the man's face. She believed, most of all, in the sick, cold terror of watching a grainy 14-second clip of her daughter 3 feet from a gun, over and over, at 2 in the morning, in an office 40 floors above a city that had almost taken everything from her in the space of a single afternoon. She built a file. She built a task force. She put her best investigators on a single strip of paracord and came up with nothing, because the man she was hunting had spent a decade learning how to not be found. Evelyn Bishop had not always been a woman who filed children under the general heading of things to protect with cameras and contracts. There had been a version of her once, younger, warmer, before a decade of boardrooms taught her that softness was a door other people used to walk in and take what they wanted. She had built Bishop Holdings from a single failing logistics firm into an empire spanning 3 continents, and she had done it in rooms where every other name on the letterhead belonged to a man twice her age who assumed, wrongly, that a woman who smiled was a woman who could be moved. She had stopped smiling by 30. She had stopped, in most rooms, being anything but exact. It was not cruelty, not really. It was armor, forged one betrayal at a time, and it had kept her company and her daughter safe for 6 years, right up until the afternoon a van door slid open on a public sidewalk and reminded her that no amount of armor could be everywhere at once. In the weeks before the flower cart, that armor had been under a different kind of siege. A rival conglomerate, Halvorsen Dynamics, had been circling Bishop Holdings for the better part of a year, buying up minority shareholders, planting quiet doubts in board meetings, positioning itself to force a hostile restructuring the moment Evelyn showed the smallest crack. She felt the pressure the way a diver feels depth, in her chest, in her sleep, in the tightness behind her eyes at 3 in the morning when the spreadsheet stopped making sense. She told no one, because telling someone was, in her experience, how weakness became a headline. She simply worked longer, trusted fewer people, and held her daughter a little tighter at night without quite being able to say why. 3 miles away and several tax brackets removed from anything Evelyn Bishop had ever had to think about, Jack Coleman was scrubbing a grease stain out of his work shirt in a kitchen sink that leaked, doing the math on a hospital bill he could not pay. His daughter Maya had a fever that wouldn't break and a cough that had gone on 4 days too long, and the walk-in clinic had done what walk-in clinics do, run tests, hand him a bill, and told him gently that if it got worse, the ER was always an option, as though the ER were a place you visited instead of a hole you fell into and spent years climbing out of. Jack had $230 in a checking account and a landlord who had already mentioned, twice, that the rent was due on the 1st, not the 5th. He'd worked security overnight at a warehouse for 6 years after leaving the service, good honest work, until the company folded and took his benefits with it. Since then it had been whatever paid, loading trucks, patching drywall, standing 12-hour shifts at a call center that made his skin crawl with its fluorescent hum. None of it touched what he used to be. That was the point. He had buried that man on purpose, in a quiet ceremony with no witnesses, the day he held Maya for the first time and promised her, silently, that she would never have a father who came home with someone else's blood still under his fingernails. Jack had not always measured his worth in cash rate hourly wages. There had been a version of him, too, once, younger, harder, moving through compounds in countries he was never allowed to name to people back home, doing work that the government thanked him for in classified rooms and never once in public. He had been good at it. Frighteningly good, the kind of good that gets you handed harder assignments instead of easier ones, until the day he came home from a deployment and held his newborn daughter for the first time and understood, with a clarity sharper than anything he'd felt in a firefight, that he could not keep being both things. He could not be the man who ended other men's lives with his hands and also be the man who taught a little girl to ride a bike without ever letting his grip carry the memory of what those hands had done. So he chose. He signed the discharge papers, packed one duffel bag, and drove across 3 states to a city where nobody knew his name, and he buried the soldier so deep that most days even he forgot to look for him. It cost him more than he ever admitted to anyone. It cost him a marriage that hadn't survived the transition from warrior to civilian, a wife who loved the man he used to be and never quite trusted the man he was trying to become. It cost him status, income, the easy respect that came from wearing a uniform instead of coveralls stained with someone else's spilled coffee. But it bought him mornings. It bought him the sound of Maya's laugh through a paper-thin apartment wall, and pancakes on Saturdays, and the specific, unglamorous joy of being the only name she ever called out for in the dark. He would have made the trade 1,000 times over. But promises don't pay hospital bills, and pride is a luxury a single father with a sick child cannot always afford. So when Jack saw the flyer at the Union Hall, emergency day labor needed, Bishop Tower, maintenance and facilities, cash same day, apply in person, he swallowed something old and bitter and put on the cleanest shirt he owned. Bishop Tower rose out of downtown like a blade, all glass and cold light, the kind of building that made a man in a $15 shirt feel the exact weight of every dollar he didn't have. Jack rode the freight elevator with 6 other men, all of them quiet in the way people are quiet when the room itself is judging them, and he was midway through mopping a spill in the executive lobby, sleeves rolled, forearms scarred in ways nobody in that building would ever ask about, when the elevator chimed and half the floor seemed to straighten its spine at once. Evelyn Bishop moved through her own building like weather. Jack didn't look up right away. He'd learned, over years of unglamorous work, that looking up cost you time and sometimes cost you your job, but he heard the click of heels stop 3 feet from his bucket, and when he did look up, he found himself looking at a woman who had clearly not slept properly in days, and whose exhaustion had curdled into something sharp. "You're blocking the elevator bank," she said, not quite to him, more at him, the way you'd address a misplaced piece of furniture. "Almost done, ma'am," Jack said, and started to slide the bucket aside. "Not fast enough." Her head of security, a lean, sharp-suited man named Marcus Reyes, who had a smile that never once touched his eyes, stepped in like he'd been waiting all morning for a reason to matter. "This is a place of business," Reyes said, loud enough for the lobby to hear, "not a homeless shelter. Get your bucket and get out of the way of people who actually work here." A ripple of laughter went through 2 junior executives near the coffee cart. Jack felt the old current move under his skin, the readiness, the part of him that had once ended arguments before they finished being arguments, and he shut it down the way he'd trained himself to, breathing out slow, eyes on the floor tile. "Yes, sir," he said, and moved the bucket. Evelyn looked at him for one more second, cataloging him the way she cataloged everything, filing him under the general heading of people she did not need to think about again, and walked on. Jack finished the mop job, collected his cash at the end of the shift, and went home to sit by his daughter's bed and dab a cool cloth against her forehead, and he did not think about Bishop Tower again until 3 days later, when Maya's fever finally broke and the agency called to ask if he could cover another shift, and the money was the money, so he said yes. It was on that second visit that Chloe Bishop, trailing a nanny through the lobby on her way to her mother's office for a school project about what my parent does, stopped dead in the middle of the marble floor and stared at a man in gray coveralls repairing a wall panel. She knew the voice before she consciously placed it. "Hey, you're okay. You're okay now." She knew the set of his shoulders, the particular gentleness in a man built like a closed door. She tugged so hard on the nanny's sleeve that the woman nearly dropped her phone. "That's him," Chloe said, breathless, pointing without shame, the way only children point. "That's my guardian angel. That's the man who saved me." The nanny, flustered, tried to hush her. Jack, halfway up a stepladder with a panel screw in his hand, felt his stomach drop the way it used to drop in the seconds before a door breach. Not fear exactly, but the total body awareness that the situation had just changed and there was no controlling what came next. He came down off the ladder slowly. Knelt so he was eye level with her. "Hey there," he said softly. "You doing okay?" "You saved me," Chloe whispered, like it was a secret between them, and in a way it was. "The bad men. You made them go away." Jack didn't confirm it. Didn't deny it either. He just smiled, the small tired smile of a man who has spent his whole adult life being invisible on purpose, and said, "I'm real glad you're safe, sweetheart," and went back up the ladder before the nanny could ask him a single question he'd have to lie his way out of. But children do not keep secrets the way adults want them to, and by that evening, Chloe had told her mother everything, the coveralls, the ladder, the voice, the certainty that only a 6-year-old can carry into a room and set down like undeniable fact. Evelyn listened with the particular stillness of a woman deciding whether to believe something too good, and too strange, to be true. "Chloe, baby, lots of people have kind voices," she said carefully. "It's him, Mommy. I know his eyes." Chloe crossed her arms, immovable. "You have to say sorry to him. Reyes was mean to him. I saw it." That detail landed harder than anything else. Evelyn sat with it a long time after Chloe had gone to bed, running the security footage from the lobby confrontation on a loop, watching a man absorb an insult with his jaw locked and his hands perfectly still, watching herself walk past him like he was a smudge on the glass. She told herself it was probably nothing. She told herself a great many things that week that turned out, eventually, not to be true. She almost talked herself out of it twice. It was, by any reasonable accounting, absurd, a billionaire chasing a rumor sparked by a 6-year-old's imagination, built on nothing sturdier than a matching build and a piece of frayed cord. Her chief of staff told her, gently, that she was exhausted and grieving a scare she hadn't allowed herself to properly feel yet, and that chasing a janitor around her own building was not the behavior of a woman running a company under siege from Halvorsen Dynamics. Evelyn knew he was right, in the way people are right about things that do not matter once a mother has decided something in her bones. She canceled 2 meetings. She pulled the man's file herself instead of delegating it, because some small, stubborn part of her needed to look him in the eyes and be told no, in his own voice, before she could let it go. The next morning, she had Jack Coleman pulled from his shift and brought to her office. He walked in still wearing his coveralls, hands raw from cleaning solvent, and stood in the doorway of a room bigger than his entire apartment, uncertain whether he was about to be fired or fired at. "Sit," Evelyn said, not unkindly, though the habit of command was so deep in her it came out that way regardless. "I'll stand, if it's all the same," Jack said. "Don't want to get anything on your furniture." Something in that answer needled her, not the words, but the dignity underneath them, the total absence of the fear or resentment she'd expected. She studied him a long moment, then slid a folder across the desk. "Not a check yet. First, a test. My daughter says you saved her life outside a flower market 4 days ago." Jack's face didn't move. Years of training had taught him that. "Don't know anything about that, ma'am. She's very specific. Kids got big imaginations." Evelyn almost let it go. Almost. But then she opened a drawer and set a strip of frayed paracord on the desk between them, recovered from the scene, tested, logged, useless to every investigator she'd hired, and watched Jack Coleman's eyes flick to it and hold there for exactly 1 second too long. "That was in your pocket," she said quietly. "Security review from the flower market confirms a man matching your build, walking away from the scene, missing that exact item. I had 3 private investigators fail to identify you. My daughter did it in 4 seconds." The silence stretched. Jack finally exhaled, slow, and something in his posture shifted, not surrender, but the particular relief of a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long way. "She's safe," he said. "That's the only part that matters to me." Evelyn, moved despite herself, despite every instinct that told her not to be, reached for the leather folder and slid it toward him, open to reveal a check with a number on it that could have paid off Jack's debts a dozen times over. "This is my gratitude," she said. "Take it. Buy your family whatever you need. Consider it done, and consider us even." Jack looked at the number for a long moment. Then he closed the folder and pushed it gently back across the desk. "I don't want your money," he said. "I didn't do it for money, and taking it now would make it feel like I did. All I want is the wage I earned mopping your floor. That's a fair trade for a fair day's work. What happened outside that flower cart wasn't work. It was just what a person does." He turned and left before she could argue, and Evelyn Bishop sat alone in an office that suddenly felt smaller than it had an hour before, staring at a check nobody wanted, understanding for the first time in years that her money had just failed to buy the one thing she actually needed to feel, forgiveness she hadn't fully earned yet. She could not let it go after that. It gnawed at her the way unsolved things always did. She ran a background check the way she ran everything, thorough and merciless, expecting to find debt, maybe a prior arrest, some ordinary explanation for an ordinary man. Instead her analyst came back pale and uncertain, saying most of the file was sealed, redacted at a level she'd only seen twice before in her life, both times attached to men who did work the government didn't officially admit existed. Jack Coleman, janitor, floor 41, temp contract, cash rate $18 an hour, had once, under a different classification, been a person capable of things Evelyn Bishop had no framework for. She might have found a way to reconcile all of it, might have found her way toward the apology her daughter kept insisting on, if she'd had more time. Instead, the redacted file sat open on her desk for 3 days, a puzzle she turned over in idle moments between board calls, while outside her window Halvorson Dynamics quietly finalized a partnership that would prove far more dangerous than any hostile bid on paper. What Evelyn did not know, what no one at Bishop Holdings knew until it was almost too late, was that the leverage Halvorson needed to force her hand had been walking her hallways in a tailored suit for the better part of 2 years, smiling at her in board meetings, assuring her that security was handled. It happened on a Thursday, fast and total. The elevators froze mid-shaft, the internal comms cut to static, and the glass doors on every floor locked with a mechanical finality that made junior staff scream before they understood why. Marcus Reyes revealed himself in the chaos with the practiced calm of a man who had built this moment for months, feeding building schematics and security codes to a rival conglomerate that wanted Bishop Tower's assets stripped and sold before Evelyn even understood she'd been betrayed. Armed men in tactical gear swept the executive floor with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed this too, herding terrified staff into the boardroom, dragging Evelyn and a shrieking Chloe toward the center of it all while Reyes stood by the windows with the calm satisfaction of a man collecting a debt. "Sign the transfer," he told her, sliding a tablet across the table, "and everyone gets to go home to their families. Refuse, and we find out how long a building this tall can stay locked down before somebody upstairs decides collateral damage is an acceptable cost." 40 floors below, in a basement utility corridor that smelled like bleach and old copper pipe, Jack felt the building's power grid stutter and die around him, and something in his chest went very still and very cold. He didn't know yet what was happening upstairs. He only knew the particular wrongness of a system failing all at once, in patterns too clean to be accidental, emergency lighting kicking in a beat too late, backup generators that should have caught the load staying stubbornly silent, the low mechanical groan of elevator brakes engaging mid-shaft instead of returning to ground floor the way protocol demanded. He'd seen buildings taken before, in another life, in another country. This felt exactly like that, except the walls were marble instead of cinder block and the people trapped inside wore tailored suits instead of Kevlar. He set down his mop against the wall, and for a moment he simply stood there in the dark, listening to his own pulse, feeling the old readiness rise up through him like water finding its level. He thought of walking to the loading dock exit, of simply leaving the way any sensible maintenance worker would, of getting home to Maya and letting whatever was happening 40 floors above him be somebody else's emergency. It would have been the reasonable choice. It would have kept the promise he'd made the day his daughter was born. Then he found a mercenaries dropped radio wedged behind a fire extinguisher near the stairwell door, its channels still open, crackling with chatter about executive floor secured and asset acquisition in progress, and a second voice, tighter, more anxious, asking what to do about the girl, and the last decade of quiet, careful ordinary life folded up and put itself away, the way a soldier folds a flag. He thought of Maya first. Only for a second. Then he thought of a 6-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat who had called him her guardian angel, and he understood, with total clarity, that there was no version of himself that could hide in a basement while that girl was in danger 40 floors above him. He moved through the building's blue-collar arteries the way other men moved through hallways, vents, maintenance shafts, the electrical closets that architects never expect anyone to actually use, all of it mapped in his mind from 3 weeks of quiet, unglamorous labor that the mercenaries upstairs had never bothered to learn, because men who parachute into a building for one violent afternoon rarely think to study the parts of it that keep the lights on and the pipes from bursting. That, Jack understood better than almost anyone alive, was always the mistake powerful people made. They fortified the front door and forgot that a building had 100 other ways in, all of them known intimately by the people they paid least and noticed least. He improvised his first weapon from a length of pipe and a roll of electrical tape, wrapping the grip until it sat right in his palm the way a rifle stock used to, and he found the first patrol of 2 men in a service stairwell on sublevel 2, moving with the loose confidence of men who believed the building already belonged to them. It was over before either of them understood what had entered the space with them, one strike to drop the nearest man's balance, a second to put him down for good, and by the time the third heartbeat passed, his partner was disarmed and unconscious against the cinder block wall, and Jack had not raised his voice above a whisper the entire time. He took their radio, keyed the channel, and let his voice carry to every earpiece in the building, flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had made this particular kind of promise before and always kept it. "You have 2 men down on sublevel 2, he said. "You've got 38 more floors, and I know this building better than the men who built it. Walk away now, and I'll let you." The silence on the other end of that radio was, for Marcus Reyes, the first genuine fear he'd felt all day. Upstairs, Evelyn heard the broadcast crackle through a guard's radio and felt something impossible bloom in her chest. She looked at Reyes, whose composure had visibly cracked, and understood, in the space of a breath, exactly who was coming for them. "Nobody's coming to save you," Reyes snapped at her, though the words sounded thinner now, aimed as much at himself as at her. "Your precious security team is locked out. Your board is useless. There is no one." "There's someone," Evelyn said quietly, and for the first time in years, hope did not feel like a weakness. It felt like the only true thing she'd believed all day. She thought of a redacted file, of a folded check pushed gently back across her desk, of her daughter's absolute certainty. She thought, with something close to shame, of the way she'd once told that same man to get his bucket out of her way. Jack worked his way upward one floor at a time, methodical, silent, using the mercenaries' own overconfidence against them, until the men on the executive level began to understand that something in the building was hunting them rather than the other way around. Patrol after patrol went dark. Radio checks went unanswered. Somewhere around the 20th floor, the panic in the mercenaries' chatter started to outweigh the discipline, men calling for backup that never answered, men suggesting, in increasingly urgent whispers, that maybe the payout wasn't worth whatever was moving through the stairwells beneath them. Jack heard all of it and felt none of the satisfaction he once might have. There was no pride left in this kind of work for him, only the singular, driving need to reach a little girl in a boardroom 40 floors above his head before someone's finger found a trigger out of fear instead of calculation. When he finally breached the executive suite, it was without ceremony, a controlled charge from a fire extinguisher rigged with maintenance chemicals, enough to disorient two guards long enough for Jack to close the distance and finish what the chaos started, moving through the smoke and confusion with the calm of a man who had done this exact thing in far worse places, for far higher stakes, and had never once let the noise slow him down. He found Reyes exactly where he'd expected, near the windows, tablet still in hand, a pistol now pressed hard against Chloe's shoulder and the desperate arithmetic of a cornered man. "Stay back," Reyes said, voice cracking around the edges. "I will use her. I don't care what you are." "I know exactly what you are," Jack said, stepping forward anyway, calm in the specific, terrible way of a man who had made peace with violence a long time ago and only ever used it in service of something worth protecting. "You're a man who thought fear was the same thing as power. It never was." He closed the distance faster than Reyes's finger could find the trigger's resistance, redirected the weapon with a motion too clean to be anything but a decade of practice, and put Marcus Reyes on the floor with a single, economical strike that ended the standoff before Chloe had time to fully register the danger she'd been in. He scooped her up in the same motion, checked her over with the same gentleness he'd shown her outside the flower cart, and only then let himself look at Evelyn Bishop, who stood frozen by the boardroom table with tears cutting clean lines through the composure she'd spent a lifetime building. "You're safe," Jack said simply, setting Chloe down beside her mother. "Both of you. That's all that ever mattered to me." The police arrived 20 minutes later to find Marcus Reyes zip-tied to a chair with fire hose cord, his co-conspirators disarmed and stacked like firewood on the sublevel stairwell, and a building full of terrified employees slowly understanding that they had survived something because one man in gray coveralls had refused to stay hidden. Evelyn found Jack afterward on the executive floor, alone by the window, watching the city lights come back on floor by floor as power was restored, looking like a man already trying to disappear back into the ordinary life he'd built for himself. "I owe you an apology," she said, and her voice, for the first time since he'd met her, had no ice in it at all. "Not for today. For the lobby. For assuming a man's worth from the state of his shirt. I was wrong about you in every way a person can be wrong about another person, and I am deeply, deeply sorry." Jack turned, and something in his face, guarded for so long, worn smooth by years of swallowing his pride to keep his daughter fed, softened. "You didn't know me," he said. "Most people judge what's in front of them. That's not a sin, Ms. Bishop. It's just human. What matters is what you do once you know better." "Then let me do better," Evelyn said. "Not charity. Not a check I know you'll refuse again. A position, head of security, real title, real salary, benefits for you and your daughter, built around the fact that you are, without question, the most capable and the most honorable man I have ever met. Let me build something with you instead of throwing money past you." Jack was quiet a long moment, thinking of hospital bills and eviction notices and a daughter who deserved a father who didn't have to choose between his pride and her well-being, and thinking, too, of the promise he'd made the day Maya was born, not a promise to hide forever, he realized now, but a promise to only ever use what he was in service of the people he loved. "For my daughter," he said finally. "I'll say yes for her." "Good," Evelyn said, and for the first time, she smiled at him the way she'd never once smiled at anyone in that building, without armor, without calculation, just relief, and gratitude, and the beginning of something that felt, against every instinct she'd spent a lifetime building, like trust. The story of what happened inside Bishop Tower that Thursday never made it to the press in anything close to its true shape. Evelyn made sure of that, not out of shame, but out of respect for a man who had spent a decade building a quiet life precisely so that headlines would never find him again. The official statement mentioned a security breach, swiftly contained, credited to the diligence of Bishop Holdings' internal response team. Marcus Reyes and his co-conspirators disappeared into a legal process far less forgiving than anything they'd shown Evelyn's employees that afternoon, and Halvorsen Dynamics, its fingerprints suddenly very visible on a federal investigation, spent the next several months explaining itself to regulators instead of circling anyone's boardroom. For Jack, the weeks that followed felt less like a beginning and more like an exhale he'd been holding for 10 years. He gave notice at the call center without a single pang of regret. He signed paperwork that made Maya's medical coverage a formality instead of a crisis, and for the first time since she was born, he fell asleep some nights without doing math in his head. He did not become a different man in the corner office Evelyn gave him. He kept the same watch he'd worn through 2 deployments, the same battered truck, the same habit of double-checking every exit in a room before he sat down in it. What changed was smaller, and larger, than any of that. He no longer had to pretend, in front of the people who mattered, that the man capable of clearing a building full of armed mercenaries and the man capable of braiding his daughter's hair before school were 2 different people who could never be allowed in the same room. He was both. He had always been both. He simply, finally, let himself be seen. Weeks later, on a Saturday when Bishop Tower stood quiet and ordinary against the skyline, Jack sat on a park bench with a little girl in a yellow raincoat on one side of him and his own daughter, cheeks pink and healthy now, on the other, while Evelyn Bishop, billionaire, mother, and finally, a woman learning to see people instead of price tags, brought over 3 ice cream cones and sat down beside them like it was the easiest thing in the world. Chloe leaned into Jack's side, utterly certain, the way only children can be certain of the truest things. "Told you he was my guardian angel," she said. And Jack, watching his daughter laugh at something Chloe whispered to her, allowed himself, for the first time in over a decade, to simply be exactly who he was, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed, just a father, in the daylight, with nothing left to bury.